Imagine two figures standing across from one another in the pale light of dawn. The air is heavy with silence. Their seconds stand by, tense, while a pair of pistols, or perhaps rapiers, glitter faintly in the morning mist. These are not criminals or soldiers. They are gentlemen, officers, even politicians. They are about to risk their lives, not for wealth, not for power, but for something far harder to understand: honor. Duels have always fascinated and unsettled us. They seem irrational, even reckless. Why would educated men, sometimes at the height of their careers, deliberately seek out a fight that could end their lives in moments? Why risk everything, family, reputation, future, over an insult, a glance, or a rumor? The answer is not simple. Beneath the dramatic surface of dueling lies a web of dark secrets, rules hidden in plain sight, unspoken codes, and motives that went far deeper than pride alone. Tonight, we are going to unravel those secrets. From the strange rituals that governed every duel, to the reasons people accepted death rather than apology, to the ways these private battles shaped politics, law, and even society itself. This is not just the story of swords and pistols. It is the story of human obsession with reputation, fear of shame, and the desperate need to be seen as honorable, even if it meant dying at dawn. Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. If you enjoy these calm but fascinating journeys into the past, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's step quietly into the hidden world of duels and uncover the secrets no one ever told you. The first thing to imagine is the silence. Not the silence of a calm meadow or a peaceful night, but the tense, heavy quiet that falls just before something irreversible begins. Two men face each other, their boots damp from dew, their faces pale in the morning light. No crowds cheer them. No soldiers stand in ranks. Only a handful of witnesses wait at the edges of the field, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes darting from man to man. The duel is not a public show. It is a private storm. And that silence, that strange ritual of secrecy, was not an accident. It was the essence of why duels were fought at dawn. Far from curious eyes, hidden under the weight of unspoken rules. The duel, to those who lived by it, was not murder. It was not chaos. It was a language, a ritualized conversation, spoken not with words, but with weapons. To understand why duels were fought, one must understand why they were hidden. Silence preserved honor. Silence created a boundary between civilized men and criminals. Silence transformed violence into something that could be justified. For all its drama, the duel was built on discretion, and the first rule of discretion was to fight in secret, in the pale hours of the morning. But why dawn? Why not broad daylight? Why not the center of town? The answer lies in a mix of law, custom, and psychology. By the 17th and 18th centuries, dueling was officially illegal in much of Europe. Authorities tried again and again to stamp it out, recognizing its danger. Yet men continued to fight, slipping away from their homes before the city woke, gathering in secluded fields or hidden gardens, sometimes even in forests or on riverbanks. Dawn gave them cover, both literal and symbolic. The pale light made secrecy possible. The hour before the city stirred meant fewer eyes to witness what was forbidden. And the very liminality of dawn, the moment between night and day, matched the liminality of the duel, standing between life and death, between law and honor. Silence also preserved reputation. To be called a duelist openly was to risk scandal or punishment, but to fight quietly, with trusted seconds and chosen witnesses, meant that word of the duel could be shaped carefully afterward. The story could be told with dignity. The challenge was offered, the terms agreed, the men behaved as gentlemen, and honor was satisfied. Without secrecy, the duel became brawling. With secrecy, it became ritual. This distinction mattered more than anything. Those who fought duels knew that reputation was fragile. A whispered insult at a banquet, a careless joke in a tavern, even a glance taken the wrong way could stain a man's name. And in a world where social standing determined careers, marriages, alliances, and fortunes, a damaged reputation could ruin a life. The duel, then, was not only about pride, but about survival in society. Yet paradoxically, survival in society required the duel to be hidden. A man could not be seen as bloodthirsty or reckless. He had to be seen as restrained, honorable, reluctant even, but willing to fight when necessary. Silence allowed this delicate balance. Witnesses played a crucial role in maintaining that silence. The seconds, the trusted friends chosen by each duelist, were more than assistants. They were guardians of honor, referees, negotiators, and afterward, storytellers. Their word carried weight. They confirmed that the rules were followed, that no treachery occurred, that both men behaved with dignity. If blood was shed, they could declare that honor was satisfied and bring the duel to an end. If death occurred, they could testify that it was not murder, but the tragic result of a ritual. Without seconds, the duel would be lawless. With seconds, it became almost legal, cloaked in silence, but dressed in formality. Consider also the psychology of dawn itself. To fight at this hour was to face mortality in the starkest way. The pale, cold light sharpened the senses. The stillness amplified every sound, the cock's crow, the rustling of clothing, the click of a pistol being loaded. The duelist stood between darkness and daylight, between anonymity and exposure. It was a moment that forced clarity. Men often wrote letters the night before, farewells to family, instructions for estates, apologies never to be spoken. By dawn, they were ready, or as ready as one could be, to stake everything on a single confrontation. The silence of the hour mirrored the silence of mortality itself, that private passage no one could share. We must not think of duels as random explosions of violence. They were controlled, measured, wrapped in layers of silence. Insults were not shouted in public, but addressed through carefully written challenges. The duel itself was not a brawl in a tavern, but a choreographed meeting, set in a chosen place, at a chosen time, with chosen weapons. Even the deaths, when they came, were often recorded with restraint. A gentleman fell, a shot was true, Honor was satisfied. The silence of the duel was its shield, its disguise, its justification. But beneath this silence was fear. Fear of shame, fear of cowardice, fear of losing not only the fight, but the social position that defined one's identity. This fear was as sharp as any blade. A man who refused a challenge might live, but his reputation could wither. He could be branded a coward, excluded from polite society, denied advancement in career or influence. The duel, then, was not only about pride, but about survival in society. Yet paradoxically, survival in society required the duel to be hidden. A man could not be seen as bloodthirsty or reckless. He had to be seen as restrained, honorable, reluctant even, but willing to fight when necessary. Silence allowed this delicate balance. Witnesses played a crucial role in maintaining that silence. The seconds, the trusted friends chosen by each duelist, were more than assistants. They were guardians of honor, referees, negotiators, and afterward, storytellers. Their word carried weight. They confirmed that the rules were followed, that no treachery occurred, that both men behaved with dignity. If blood was shed, they could declare that honor was satisfied and bring the duel to an end. If death occurred, they could testify that it was not murder, but the tragic result of a ritual. Without seconds, the duel would be lawless. With seconds, it became almost legal, cloaked in silence, but dressed in formality. Consider also the psychology of dawn itself. To fight at this hour was to face mortality in the starkest way. The pale, cold light sharpened the senses. The stillness amplified every sound, the cock's crow, the rustling of clothing, the click of a pistol being loaded. The duelist stood between darkness and daylight, between anonymity and exposure. It was a moment that forced clarity. Men often wrote letters the night before, farewells to family, instructions for estates, even apologies never to be spoken. By dawn, they were ready, or as ready as one could be, to stake everything on a single confrontation. The silence of the hour mirrored the silence of mortality itself, that private passage no one could share. We must not think of duels as random explosions of violence. They were controlled, measured, wrapped in layers of silence. Insults were not shouted in public, but addressed through carefully written challenges. The duel itself was not a brawl in a tavern, but a choreographed meeting, set in a chosen place, at a chosen time, with chosen weapons. Even the deaths, when they came, were often recorded with restraint. A gentleman fell, a shot was true, honor was satisfied. The silence of the duel was its shield, its disguise, its justification. But beneath this silence was fear. Fear of shame, fear of cowardice, fear of losing not only the fight, but the social position that defined one's identity. This fear was as sharp as any blade. A man who refused a challenge might live, but his reputation could wither. He could be branded a coward, excluded from polite society.
Imagine two men, equally tense, equally determined, standing across from one another with weapons in their hands. The dawn is pale, the grass wet, and the silence heavy. Yet before a shot is fired or a sword is raised, before the first move is made, there exists something invisible but powerful that guides every action: the code. Not a law passed by kings, not a rule book printed in courts, but a shared understanding, a web of unspoken agreements, a code of honor that shaped who lived, who died, and, most importantly, who was remembered as a gentleman. To modern eyes, duels look like reckless violence, but to those who fought them, every duel was bound by a code so strict and so detailed that it turned chaos into ritual. Without the code, a duel was a crime. With it, a duel was an act of honor. The strange power of the duel lay not in the weapon, but in the rules surrounding it. These rules were not always written, though later manuals would attempt to codify them. They were carried in memory, passed down in whispers, and enforced by witnesses called seconds. The duelists themselves were bound not only by the risk of injury or death, but by the far greater risk of dishonor if they broke the code. A man could survive a duel physically, but lose his reputation forever if he was seen as unfair, cowardly, or dishonorable. And reputation, in the society of dueling, mattered more than life itself. The first and most important rule was that a duel must arise from insult. Not just any quarrel would do. To pull a sword in anger in the middle of a tavern was brawling, and brawling belonged to commoners. But when a gentleman felt his honor stained by a word, a gesture, a rumor, or even a glance, then a duel was the proper remedy. Honor was delicate, fragile like glass. A single crack could ruin it. The code demanded that insult could not go unanswered. Yet paradoxically, the code also demanded restraint. One did not leap immediately to violence. Instead, a challenge was issued, often in writing, delivered by a second. The formality was essential. The code required not only courage, but patience. The second rule was equality. Duels had to be fought between men of equal standing. A nobleman could not duel a peasant without losing face, for to fight beneath one's rank was to acknowledge equality where none was recognized. A duel between equals preserved the symmetry of honor. It was not about punishing inferiors or asserting dominance. It was about proving oneself among peers. This equality extended to the weapons as well. Both men had to face the same risk with the same pistols or the same swords chosen in agreement. To tilt the balance was to betray the code, and betrayal of the code was worse than death. Another rule dictated that the seconds had the power to attempt reconciliation before the duel began. In fact, many duels were resolved without bloodshed because the seconds negotiated apologies that satisfied both parties. A carefully worded statement, a gesture of respect, a formal withdrawal of insult. These could sometimes restore honor without violence. But if no compromise could be reached, the code required the duel to proceed. And once weapons were drawn, hesitation could itself be seen as dishonor. The code also governed where and when the duel took place. As we have seen, dawn was the favored hour, silence the favored atmosphere. The ground had to be chosen carefully, not only for secrecy, but for fairness. Pistols required a level field. Swords required space to maneuver. Distance was measured precisely, steps counted aloud. The slightest irregularity could be interpreted as unfairness, and unfairness was as damning as cowardice. The code demanded balance, symmetry, ritual precision. Perhaps the strangest rule was the rule of satisfaction. A duel was not always fought to the death. Sometimes a single drop of blood was enough, sometimes even a missed shot or a scratch of the blade. What mattered was not the wound itself, but the willingness to risk it. A man who stood his ground, who allowed his opponent to fire at him, or who crossed blades without flinching, had proven his courage. Honor was restored, even if no one fell. Death was not the goal. The demonstration of bravery was. This principle kept many duels short and less deadly than legend suggests, though of course many still ended in tragedy. The code forbade cruelty. A man who attacked after his opponent was wounded or who struck an unfair blow was condemned. He might win the duel physically, but lose in society's eyes. He would be marked as dishonorable, unworthy of respect, excluded from the very circle that dueling was meant to protect. Thus, even as two men tried to kill or wound each other, there was an invisible boundary of restraint, a line they dared not cross. It was this paradox, that violence could be restrained by honor, that made dueling both so strange and so compelling. What makes these unwritten rules fascinating is how consistently they were observed across countries in centuries. In France, in England, in Italy, in Germany, the details varied, but the principles remained. Honor required the duel to be formal, equal, and restrained. Witnesses were always present. Reconciliation was always offered. The possibility of satisfaction without death always hovered in the air. And yet, despite these restraints, the risk of death was real, and it was that risk which gave the duel its power. To break the code was to break oneself. A man who shot before the signal, who attacked dishonorably, or who refused to fight at all after issuing a challenge, was finished. Socially, he might live, but he lived in disgrace. The code was merciless in this way. Better to die with honor than to live in shame. This belief drove men again and again to fields at dawn, guided less by anger than by fear of humiliation. The duel was not only about proving courage to an opponent, it was about proving courage to society itself. And so beneath the silence of every duel, there was this invisible structure of rules. They were not written in law books, but they were carved into the expectations of society. Everyone who mattered knew them, and those who broke them paid the price. It was a code upheld not by courts, but by the judgment of peers, a judgment that could ruin a man more thoroughly than any wound. The duel was a theater of risk, and the code was its script. As you drift tonight, picture again that pale field at dawn. The duelists stand facing each other, but behind them stand the rules, invisible yet powerful. Every step they take, every word they speak, every motion of weapon or hand is shaped by the code. It is this code that turns violence into ritual, chaos into ceremony, and death into honor. And in that code lies the dark secret of why duels endured so long, not because men loved to fight, but because men feared to live without honor.
Imagine standing in a crowded banquet hall, the air heavy with the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine, The tables lined with nobles, officers, or wealthy merchants. Conversations overlap in a murmur of laughter, negotiation, and gossip. Then, in the midst of it all, a single word is spoken with a sharper edge than any blade. Perhaps it is a careless jest, a remark about a man's courage, a whispered suggestion about his family's honor, or simply a glance held too long. The laughter fades, the air shifts, and everyone present understands what has just happened. A duel has been born. No weapon has yet been drawn, no blood has been spilled, but the insult hangs in the room heavier than steel. In the culture of honor, words could wound more deeply than swords, and to leave them unanswered was to let one's reputation bleed away in silence. The paradox of the duel was that it was rarely about the actual insult itself. Few men truly risked their lives over a casual remark. What they fought for was the principle behind it, the fragile currency of reputation. In societies where social standing determined power, wealth, and opportunity, to be seen as weak, cowardly, or dishonored was ruinous. An insult was not merely an injury to pride. It was an attack on a man's entire identity, on the way others saw him, on his ability to command respect in business, politics, or even family life. Thus, an insult demanded reply, and in the absence of apology, the duel became the ultimate reply. The range of insults that could provoke a duel might surprise us. Today, we might shrug at a sarcastic comment or laugh off a slight, but in earlier centuries, reputation was sharper and more brittle. A suggestion that a man had lied, that his courage was questionable, or that his family was dishonorable could not be ignored. Even the way a man looked at another, the tone of his laughter, or the way he refused to raise a glass in acknowledgement could be interpreted as an insult. In armies and courts alike, men lived in constant vigilance, careful to maintain dignity and equally ready to defend it at the smallest provocation. It was less about the insult itself than about how it was perceived, and perception was everything. Some insults were deliberate, used as weapons in themselves. Rivals in politics or society knew that a few carefully chosen words could provoke an opponent into a duel, creating an opportunity to humiliate or eliminate him. Others were accidental, born of clumsy jokes or misunderstandings. But whether intentional or not, once spoken, an insult could not be withdrawn. The rules of honor demanded response. A man who remained silent was marked forever as a coward. A man who responded rashly without proper challenge was dismissed as brutish. Only the duel, formal and measured, restored balance. What fascinates us is the role of witnesses in all this. An insult spoken in private could sometimes be settled with apology, but when heard by others, when echoing in the ears of peers, it became something more dangerous. The presence of an audience magnified every word, turning it into a test of character. A man might forgive in private what he could never forgive in public. Thus, many duels were born not in true hatred, but in the quiet tyranny of reputation, in the knowledge that others were watching and judging. Words that might otherwise be shrugged off became deadly because they were spoken where others could hear. The language of insult itself became ritualized. In some cultures, to call another man a liar was the gravest offense, more dangerous than threats of violence. To question his courage, to mock his ancestry, or to suggest infidelity in his family carried equal weight. These were words that cut so deeply into reputation that only blood could repair the wound. And yet, in the strangest twist, even the process of challenging to a duel required words of its own. Formal letters, carefully composed, carried by seconds, demanding satisfaction. The insult might be born of heat and impulse, but the challenge had to be cold and deliberate. In this way, words governed both the beginning and the end of the duel, sharper than steel at every stage. What is remarkable is how often these words did not lead to death. Many duels ended with apologies negotiated at the field, with both men acknowledging that the point of honor had been satisfied. Sometimes pistols were fired into the air, sometimes swords crossed briefly without intent to kill. The ritual of answering the insult mattered more than the outcome. The very act of standing on the field, weapon in hand, proved that the man would not allow words to pass unanswered. Honor was restored not by killing, but by showing the willingness to die. Yet the risk of death was always present, and that risk gave weight to the entire ritual. Without danger, the duel was meaningless. With danger, it was irresistible. We may shake our heads at the fragility of honor, at the way a single word could lead to bloodshed, but perhaps we are not so different. Even today, reputations are fragile, though they live online rather than in banquet halls. A careless comment, a public slight, a rumor spread can still wound, still ruin. We no longer fight with pistols at dawn, but we still live under the weight of perception, still fight battles of words that cut as deeply as swords. The duel has faded, but the power of words remains. In the medieval and early modern world, though, there was no separation between words and action. To insult was to wound, to challenge was to fight, and to fight was to prove identity. A man's life was measured not only by his deeds, but by how he answered words sharper than swords. In this way, language became as deadly as any weapon, and silence was never an option. The duel was born in the mouth before it was fought with the hand. So, as you drift into sleep tonight, imagine once more the banquet hall. The laughter has died, the music has stilled, and two men lock eyes across the table. A word has been spoken, sharp and cutting, and though no steel has been drawn, the room already feels heavy with the promise of dawn. In that fragile pause, where words have pierced deeper than swords, the duel has already begun.
Imagine the field at dawn once more, silent and cold, the grass bending beneath the weight of dew. Two duelists stand apart, but they are not alone. Behind each man is a second, a trusted friend, chosen not only for loyalty, but for judgment. At the edges of the clearing, a few witnesses stand still, their faces drawn, their breaths visible in the pale air. The duelists hold the weapons, but it is these others who shape the moment. The seconds, the witnesses, and the elaborate rituals that surrounded the duel turned a brutal act of violence into what many saw as theater, structured, choreographed, bound by rules, and performed under the watch of those who would remember and retell. This theater of death was as important as the duel itself, for without it, the act was murder.
With it, it was honor. The role of the second was as old as the practice of dueling itself. No man could step into the field without someone to stand beside him, someone to carry his challenge, arrange the terms, and guarantee fairness. The second was not just an assistant, he was a guardian of reputation. It was the second who delivered the letter of challenge, ensuring that the insult was formally addressed. It was the second who met with the opponent's second, negotiating the weapons, the distance, and the conditions. It was the seconds who measured the field, loaded the pistols, or examined the swords. Every detail mattered, for if the duel was not perfectly balanced, it lost legitimacy. The seconds ensured that no man could later claim he had been tricked or disadvantaged. Their presence was the invisible scaffolding on which honor rested. Yet the duty of the second was not only to prepare for violence, but also to prevent it if possible. According to the code, the seconds were obliged to attempt reconciliation before the duel began. They might encourage an apology, draft a statement that allowed both men to save face, or negotiate a symbolic gesture of respect. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes pistols were fired harmlessly into the air, or swords crossed briefly before the duel was ended with dignity intact. In these cases, it was the seconds who preserved life while preserving honor, and their skill in negotiation was often praised as highly as their courage in standing witness to danger. But when no compromise could be reached, it was also their role to signal the start, to count the paces, to drop the handkerchief that marked the instant when death might begin. The witnesses, too, carried weight. A duel without witnesses was suspect, its story fragile. But with witnesses, the event could be retold, justified, explained. The witnesses confirmed that the rules were followed, that the duel was fair, that honor, not malice, had guided the act. They bore the heavy responsibility of memory, for afterward it was often their voices that shaped how society judged the duel. A duel might last only seconds, but its story could last for decades, and witnesses ensured that the story carried dignity rather than disgrace. What made this gathering of men so remarkable was the ritual that bound them together. The duel was not chaos, it was choreography. The field was chosen with care, flat ground, often at the edge of a wood or near a river, somewhere secluded but not impossible to reach. The distance was measured precisely, paces counted aloud so that both men began equally. Pistols were checked and loaded openly, swords examined for fairness. The duelists were positioned face to face, given instructions in calm voices, reminded of the terms. Every movement followed a script, a ritual that gave the act legitimacy. To stray from it was to risk dishonor, even in victory. The seconds enforced silence as much as fairness. A duel was not a shouting match or a quarrel, it was a solemn ritual. The duelists were expected to behave with calm dignity, to show composure in the face of risk. To rage, to boast, to insult further was to cheapen the moment. The duel was not about noise, it was about stillness. Even the signal to begin was subtle, often nothing more than a drop of a glove or a handkerchief, a gesture as restrained as the silence around it. In this way, the duel became theater not of words, but of presence, an act defined by how one stood as much as how one struck. And yet, beneath the restraint lay immense tension. The seconds and witnesses knew they might be watching a man they loved fall in an instant. They carried the burden of that possibility, the knowledge that their duty might end in tragedy. Some seconds were forced to duel themselves, drawn into conflicts when their honor was questioned in turn. Others spent their lives haunted by the memory of what they had seen at dawn, the echo of a pistol shot, the sight of a man collapsing silently into the grass. The theater of death was not only performance, it was lived reality, etched into memory. We often imagine duels as quick, violent affairs, but in truth, much of their drama lay in this ritual, in the long minutes of preparation, in the stillness before action. Every detail was weighted with meaning. To turn away was cowardice. To rush forward was recklessness. To follow the code precisely was to show mastery of oneself. The duel was not only a contest of skill, but of composure. And it was the seconds and witnesses who guaranteed that this composure could be recognized and remembered. The rituals themselves varied by region and time, yet their essence remained: formality, equality, and restraint. In some places, the seconds loaded the pistols with both powder and ball, but left it uncertain which pistol was which, so neither man could claim advantage. In others, swords were measured against each other, their length compared to ensure fairness. The duelists might bow or salute before engaging, acknowledging each other not as enemies, but as equals bound by honor. Even in the moment of greatest risk, ritual preserved dignity. It was theater, yes, but theater with real stakes. What makes this theater of death so haunting is its paradox. On one hand, it was meant to restrain violence, to prevent chaos, to ensure fairness. On the other, it enabled violence by giving it legitimacy, cloaking it in ritual so that society could accept it. Murder and honor were divided not by the act itself, but by the presence of these rituals and those who enforced them. The seconds, the witnesses, and the elaborate rituals that surrounded the duel turned a brutal act of violence into what many saw as theater. So the theater of death was as important as the duel itself, for without it, the act was murder. With it, it was honor. The truth is that duels were rarely about killing. They were about performance, performance of courage, performance of restraint, performance of honor. The duelists were actors on a stage where the audience was small, but the consequences immense. The seconds and witnesses were the directors and narrators, ensuring the play unfolded according to script. And the rituals were the script itself, repeated across generations until they became tradition. Without these elements, the duel was meaningless. With them, it became one of the most enduring and puzzling practices of the age. As you rest tonight, imagine once more the duel at dawn. The duelists stand ready, but their hands do not move until the second gives the signal. The witnesses hold their breath, knowing they will carry this memory for the rest of their lives. The field is silent, the air still, every detail choreographed by custom. And then, in a moment as brief as it is final, the ritual gives way to action. The pistol fires, the sword strikes, the silence breaks. The theater of death is complete, its performance etched into honor, its story carried forward by those who saw.
Imagine a hall glittering with candlelight, filled with men whose futures depended not only on their wit or wealth, but on the way they were perceived by others. Among them were generals, ministers, aristocrats, and ambitious officers, all speaking with care, laughing with restraint, and watching one another with eyes as sharp as hawks. In this room, a single rumor could destroy a career. A whispered insult could undo years of labor, and hesitation in the face of challenge could end any hope of advancement. In such a world, the duel was not only a matter of personal pride, it was politics, it was power, it was the battlefield on which reputations were tested and either strengthened or destroyed. The duel, in its silence and secrecy, was more than ritual. It was the invisible currency of political life, shaping the destinies of men far beyond the field at dawn. Reputation in politics has always mattered, but in the centuries when dueling flourished, it was more fragile than ever. A man might command soldiers, negotiate treaties, or manage estates, but if his honor was publicly questioned, none of his achievements mattered. He could be excluded from circles of influence, denied opportunities, or scorned by those whose favor he required. Political life was built on trust, but that trust was not in one's abilities alone. It was in one's courage, one's willingness to defend honor, one's refusal to be humiliated. The duel became the final arbiter, the unspoken judge, the weapon that could restore a politician's standing or destroy it forever. In many cases, duels were the shadows behind official debates. A disagreement in Parliament or a dispute in a council chamber might be cloaked in words during the day, but resolved with steel or pistols at dawn. Men who argued with fiery rhetoric knew that those words carried weight beyond the chamber, for if they crossed the line into insult, they might find themselves challenged. In this way, dueling created a second, hidden layer of political life, where decisions were not made by vote or decree, but by private risk, where reputations were defended with blood rather than speeches. The duel also served as a weapon in the struggle for influence. A rival could be weakened not by defeating him in public debate, but by forcing him into a duel and questioning his courage. To decline the challenge was to be marked a coward, unfit for leadership. To accept and lose was to be physically removed from the political stage. Even survival could be costly if the duel was seen as dishonorable. Thus, men maneuvered with words not only for political advantage, but for dueling advantage, shaping their rhetoric so that an insult could corner an opponent into a contest he did not want. Politics and dueling became entwined in a dangerous dance, where ambition could be sharpened into challenge, and challenge into death. For military men, reputation was even more critical. Officers lived in a world where courage was the defining virtue. To be accused of cowardice was to lose command, to lose the trust of one's men, to lose the respect that gave authority meaning. Many duels between officers were fought not for personal grudges, but because of slights that cast doubt on bravery. A colonel mocked by a junior officer had no choice but to demand satisfaction, for if he did not, his authority would collapse. A general insulted by a rival risked not only his pride, but his career. In this way, the duel became an extension of the battlefield, a private war where reputations were defended with the same seriousness as nations defended their borders. The political consequences of duels were profound. In some cases, the death of a single man reshaped entire governments. A rising statesman cut down at dawn might leave a vacuum that others rushed to fill. A duel between influential rivals could shift alliances, create opportunities, or destabilize balance. Even those who survived carried the scars into their political careers. Some emerged stronger, their courage praised, their reputations enhanced. Others found themselves tainted by whispers of recklessness or brutality. The duel was never only about the men who fought it. It rippled outward, shaping the circles of power in which they moved. The paradox is that while duels were illegal in many regions, they were quietly tolerated, even among political elites. Kings and parliaments denounced them, laws forbade them, but society's code often overrode the law. Those in power could not afford to ignore the duel, for it was deeply rooted in the expectations of their class. To enforce the law strictly would have meant condemning half the aristocracy. Thus, the duel existed in a strange twilight, forbidden in name but accepted in practice, condemned officially but honored privately. This ambiguity gave it even more weight, for it was precisely its secrecy, its half-forbidden nature, that made it the perfect tool of politics. The rituals of the duel also reinforced political theater. Just as debates followed rules of order, duels followed codes of honor. Seconds negotiated terms like diplomats, measuring fairness, crafting compromise, and preserving dignity. The duel mirrored politics itself, formal, ritualized, but underpinned by the constant threat of conflict. Men who moved easily between council chamber and dueling ground demonstrated their mastery of both arenas, showing that they were capable not only of words, but of action. To be effective in politics was to be effective in the duel, for both demanded calculation, restraint, and readiness to risk everything at the right moment. And yet, for all its ritual, the duel revealed the fragility of political life. A man could build power for decades, only to see it collapse with a single insult unanswered. He could gain victories in battle, yet lose his career because he refused to meet an opponent at dawn. Reputation was everything, and reputation could be shattered in an instant. The duel was both the guardian and the executioner of that reputation, offering salvation to some and ruin to others. What makes this so haunting is how much energy, thought, and blood was spent on preserving something as intangible as honor. Politics, which should have been about governing, planning, and leading, often became about defending pride. Ambition was tied not to policy, but to perception, to the way others spoke of a man behind closed doors. The duel, with its ritual silence and private violence, was the ultimate expression of this obsession. Men did not fight because they wanted to kill or be killed. They fought because they could not afford to be seen as anything less than courageous. In politics, perception was reality, and the duel was perception's fiercest guardian. As you drift into rest, imagine a council chamber fading into silence after a heated debate. The men disperse, but two linger, their eyes locked. Later, as the city still sleeps, they meet in a quiet garden at dawn, their seconds at their sides, their reputations on the line. One may fall, or both may walk away unscathed. But either way, the duel will shape their futures, will ripple through politics, will become another hidden thread in the web of power. In that fragile space between law and honor, between words and weapons, politics and dueling merged into one, and reputation, delicate and unforgiving, ruled them both. Picture again the duel at dawn. Two men face each other in the half-light, their breaths visible in the chill air, their seconds silent and grave at their sides. Between them lies the decision that will shape not only their lives,
but their reputations forever. Which weapon shall they use? This moment, invisible to us centuries later, was among the most decisive. For the choice of weapons in a duel was never casual. It carried meaning, symbolism, and strategy. A rapier spoke of elegance, precision, and the long traditions of swordplay. A pistol spoke of modernity, sudden risk, and the equalizing force of powder and shot. To outsiders, these might look like tools of death. To the duelists, they were instruments of identity, the stage props upon which the theater of honor was played. The rapier was the older, more aristocratic choice. Born from centuries of swordsmanship, it carried with it an aura of refinement. To draw a rapier was not merely to fight, but to demonstrate mastery of a skill cultivated in courts and fencing halls. The slender blade, sharp and flexible, required discipline, training, and composure. A man who chose the sword declared himself not only willing to risk his life, but confident in his own technique. Duels fought with rapiers were long remembered for their grace as much as their danger, for they resembled a deadly dance. Parries and thrusts, measured steps, the clash of steel ringing in the stillness of dawn. To fight with rapiers was to bind one's honor to tradition, to prove oneself within the lineage of aristocratic warriors. Yet the rapier, for all its elegance, was not always the fairest choice. Mastery was uneven, and a skilled swordsman held clear advantage over one less trained. This imbalance sometimes led to disputes even before blades were crossed. Seconds argued, witnesses muttered, and men questioned whether true honor could be tested when skill outweighed courage. And so, as the centuries turned, another weapon rose to prominence: the pistol. The pistol was the Democrat of dueling weapons. Crude at first, unreliable, its ball often veering off course, it nonetheless offered equality. Even the most skilled swordsman could not parry a bullet. A pistol duel was a contest of nerve more than technique. The willingness to stand still, to aim with composure, to fire without flinching. In this, pistols embodied the essence of the duel, the performance of courage. A man who faced his opponent with a loaded pistol declared in the most literal sense that he would risk his life on the field of honor. Skill still mattered, steadiness of hand, familiarity with the weapon, but chance played a larger role, and with it, the sense that fate itself was the judge. The rituals surrounding pistols were elaborate. Distance was measured with care, 10, 12, sometimes 20 paces. Seconds oversaw the loading of powder and ball, ensuring fairness. Pistols were presented at the same moment, and signals were given with solemnity. Sometimes the duelists fired simultaneously. Sometimes one was permitted to fire first, with the other to answer if still standing. In some traditions, shots were exchanged until one man was hit. In others, a single round sufficed. The rules varied, but the symbolism did not. Pistols reduced the duel to its essence, stripping away elegance and leaving only raw courage in the face of mortal risk.
Yet even here, choices mattered. Some pistols were finely crafted, balanced with precision, their triggers tuned for delicacy. Others were rougher, heavier, more difficult to control. A duelist's familiarity with his weapon could tilt the odds, and disputes often arose over whether pistols should be supplied fresh, chosen by lot, or brought by the duelists themselves. Fairness was everything, for without fairness, the duel collapsed into murder. Seconds stood vigilant, weighing weapons, counting paces, ensuring equality. It was their responsibility to maintain the illusion, and sometimes the reality, that death came not from trickery, but from honor. Beyond rapiers and pistols lay a wide array of other weapons, less common but equally revealing. Small swords, lighter and shorter than rapiers, were favored in some courts for their speed. Sabers, broader and heavier, brought the aura of cavalry charges into the field of honor. In certain regions, even daggers were chosen, though such duels often descended into brutality and were frowned upon by those who upheld the code. Each weapon carried its own symbolism, its own history, its own way of shaping the duel. The choice was never random. It was part of the ritual, part of the story the duelists wished to tell. To choose a rapier was to embrace tradition, to prove oneself skilled in the art of the aristocracy. To choose a pistol was to embrace modernity, to show that one's courage lay not in skill, but in nerve. To choose another weapon was to make a statement of defiance, of individuality, of circumstance. And each choice shaped not only the outcome of the duel, but its memory. For when the duel was retold in salons, in letters, in whispers across society, the weapon itself became part of the legend. It is easy to see these weapons now only as instruments of violence, but to the men who held them, they were far more. They were symbols of who they were, of how they wished to be seen, of what they valued most. The rapier was lineage, the pistol was courage, the saber was strength. Each duel was not merely a contest of bodies, but of identities, and the weapon chosen was the stage upon which that identity was performed. And always, beneath the choice, was risk. However fair the terms, however careful the rituals, a blade could slip, a ball could fly true, and a life could end. The weapon was both symbol and executioner, a reminder that honor was measured in willingness to face mortality. To grasp a rapier's hilt, to hold a pistol steady, was to accept that one's life hung by a thread, and that that thread might break at any instant. As you drift to sleep tonight, imagine once more that field at dawn. One man holds a rapier, its blade catching the faint light of morning. The other grips a pistol, its barrel dark and heavy. Both weapons are silent, waiting, their meaning greater than their steel or powder. They are not only tools of death, but instruments of theater, shaping the story that will be told long after the duel is done. And in that silence, in that choice, lies the essence of the duel, the strange, haunting union of honor, danger, and identity, written not only in blood, but in steel and smoke.
Imagine a crowded drawing room, the chandeliers glowing, the air alive with music and conversation. Gentlemen stand in small clusters, their coats buttoned neatly, their movements restrained by formality. Women glance with curiosity from behind their fans. Laughter flits like sparks in the air, and the clinking of glasses keeps the rhythm of the evening. Then, with a single remark, a smile too sharp, or a word that cuts just slightly too deep, the atmosphere changes. Two men lock eyes. The room grows tense, for everyone present knows what may follow. The man insulted cannot simply shrug it off. He cannot laugh it away. He cannot bow and apologize, nor can he accept apology if offered clumsily. At that moment, words had lost their power, and silence was no longer an option. The only path left was the duel. To modern ears, this sounds irrational. Why risk life over a phrase, over a glance, over something that could be forgotten the next day? But in the society of dueling, an apology was not always possible. Not because men lacked the words, but because the framework of honor made those words insufficient. In a world where reputation was everything, apology could be seen as weakness, submission, even humiliation. To accept apology could look like cowardice. To offer it could look like surrender. And so men chose to fight not because they loved death, but because they loved survival in society. The duel, with all its risk, was less terrifying than the slow death of dishonor. The impossibility of apology lay in the delicate balance of honor. Honor was not a private feeling, but a public currency. It lived in the eyes of others, in whispers and judgments, in the settled gestures that marked a man's place in the social order. If a man was insulted, his peers watched closely. Would he answer? Would he let it pass? Would he defend himself with the dignity expected of his station? To walk away was not noble, it was shameful. To accept words of apology without risk was to confess weakness. And so, apology alone could never erase insult. The duel became the final proof that the insulted man valued his honor more than his life. There were times when apology might have sufficed, but only when carefully constructed. Seconds often tried to negotiate statements that allowed both parties to retreat without shame. They crafted phrases so delicately balanced that neither man lost face. One might express regret for the misunderstanding, the other might acknowledge the statement with dignity. But such solutions were fragile, and once pride was inflamed, they often collapsed. Men steeped in the code of honor were quick to see humiliation in even the most polite words, and when the room was full of witnesses, the pressure was unbearable. To accept apology, then, was to invite whispers forever. He had been insulted and swallowed his pride. Better to face pistols at dawn. What makes this even striking is that many duels were not born from hatred, but from friendship or neutrality strained by circumstance. Two men might otherwise admire each other, yet once words crossed the threshold of insult, they became trapped. Neither wished to fight, but neither could retreat. They were prisoners of their society's expectations, chained by an invisible law stricter than any written one. Their deaths, when they came, were not the result of malice, but of the impossibility of apology. The ritual itself reinforced this impossibility. Once a challenge was issued, the machinery of the duel set in motion. Seconds were chosen, terms discussed, locations decided. Each step hardened the path, making withdrawal more difficult. To stop midway looked worse than to refuse at the start. The further one went, the less space remained for words. By the time dawn broke and men stood facing each other, apology was no longer imaginable. The pistols or rapiers spoke the only language left. This obsession with honor may seem alien, yet it reveals something deeply human: the fear of humiliation. Across cultures and centuries, humiliation has been one of the strongest forces driving action. For the duelists, death was preferable to the slow, lingering shame of being remembered as cowardly, and so they chose risk. Some died quickly, others carried scars for life, but all were remembered as men who refused to bow to insult. Their choice preserved their place in the fragile hierarchy of respect. The tragedy of this system is clear in the letters left behind. Many duelists wrote farewells to their families the night before, admitting that they wished for reconciliation, that they bore no hatred, that they would gladly avoid the duel if they could, but that they could not. They confessed that society left them no alternative, that honor demanded the risk. These letters, tender and desperate, show the gulf between personal desire and social expectation. A man might love life, love family, love peace, but still step onto the field because apology was impossible. And yet, even within this rigid system, some men sought creative solutions. Pistols fired into the air, blades lowered after a symbolic clash. Such gestures allowed both parties to leave alive, their honor technically intact. But not all duels ended so mercifully. Pride, stubbornness, and the relentless gaze of witnesses often forced the contest to its brutal conclusion. The deeper secret is that the duel was not about the opponent at all. It was about the self, reflected in the mirror of society. To apologize was to admit weakness. To refuse to duel was to accept disgrace. To fight, even at risk of death, was to declare oneself unbroken. In this way, the duel was less a battle between two men than a performance before an invisible audience, the community, the class, the future memory of who they had been. And for that audience, words were never enough. Only blood, or the willingness to shed it, could speak loudly enough. So, as you drift toward rest tonight, imagine the silence after an insult has been spoken. Two men stand in a crowded room, the air thick with expectation. A word of apology might escape one's lips, but it will never be enough. The challenge is inevitable, the dawn already calling. By the time the sun rises, the choice has been made, not because hatred demanded it, but because society made apology impossible. And in that impossibility lies the dark heart of the duel. The choice of death over words, the strange and haunting logic of honor.
Imagine a dawn not unlike the countless others we have already walked through together. Pale light stretching across the horizon, mist purling over damp fields, silence pierced only by the distant cry of a bird. Two men stand opposite one another, pistols in hand or swords at the ready. To the world beyond the field, this is just another duel, one among thousands. Yet within moments, a shot will echo or steel will clash, and history itself will shift. Some duels ended in obscurity, remembered only by the families and friends of the men who stood there. Others became legendary, changing the course of nations, leaving ripples that spread across decades. Together, the famous and the forgotten duels reveal how private rituals of honor shaped public destinies. One of the most famous duels remembered in history books is that between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr in 1804, a contest that ended with the death of Hamilton,
one of America's founding figures. To the modern eye, it seems absurd that two leading statesmen would risk everything on pistols at dawn, but to them, it was inevitable. Hamilton, a man fiercely protective of his reputation, could not let Burr's words pass unanswered. Burr, equally bound by the code, could not retreat. Their duel was not only a personal tragedy, but a political earthquake. Hamilton's death weakened his party, altered the balance of power, and scarred the nation. Here we see how a duel could reach far beyond its silent field, carrying consequences for thousands who never saw the pistols raised. But alongside these grand, history-altering duels were countless others now forgotten. Officers challenging each other after disputes in camp, noblemen settling grudges over the placement of chairs at banquets, merchants defending their honor against whispered accusations. Most of these duels ended quietly, with little fanfare, their outcomes noted in private letters or in the margins of dusty court records. Yet even these forgotten duels mattered deeply at the time, for they preserved reputations, redefined friendships, and enforced the fragile system of honor that bound society together. A duel between two obscure captains might not change a nation, but it could change a regiment. A duel between two merchants might not shift governments, but it could decide the future of a trade. In this way, both the famous and the forgotten carried weight. Duels also shaped culture itself. In France, during the 16th and 17th centuries, the practice was so common that kings issued repeated edicts forbidding it. Yet noblemen ignored these commands, driven by the belief that honor mattered more than royal law. Some duels involved dozens of men sprawling into deadly melees that shocked observers but were celebrated in poems and stories. Each clash reinforced the idea that honor was not negotiable, that even the risk of death was preferable to shame. These duels, while less individually famous than Hamilton and Burr, collectively shaped the culture of nobility, cementing the duel as an institution that no decree could erase. We must also remember the duels that ended before they began. Many men stood on the field, weapons drawn, only to reconcile through the mediation of their seconds. These duels left no blood, no scars, and therefore no great stories, yet they were as significant as the ones that did. By showing up, by standing their ground, the men proved their courage. Their reputations were preserved, and society accepted them as honorable. Forgotten by history, these duels nonetheless sustained the system, quietly reinforcing the code of honor through the ritual of risk without the consequence of death. Some duels became legendary, not for their outcomes, but for their participants. Poets, writers, and artists found themselves drawn into these rituals, their creative passions spilling over into disputes of pride. Pushkin, the great Russian poet, died in such a duel, his genius silenced by a pistol shot. Others, like the French dramatist Corneille, faced duels that ended without fatality, but left their reputations altered forever. These stories remind us that dueling was not confined to soldiers and politicians. It touched all who lived within the fragile web of honor, pulling even the most brilliant minds into the theater of death. Yet for every name we remember, Hamilton, Burr, Pushkin, there are hundreds, thousands more whose duels faded into obscurity. Records of them lie in forgotten archives, their details smudged by time, their participants lost to memory. But to dismiss them as unimportant is to misunderstand history. Each duel, famous or forgotten, was a thread in the fabric of society. Each duel reinforced the code, reminded men of the risks, and taught communities the cost of honor. The famous duels are like bright stars, but the forgotten ones are the vast darkness in which those stars shine, giving them meaning. The tragedy is not only in the deaths, but in the silence that followed. Families mourning in private, careers ended before they could bloom, friendships shattered. A duel remembered by none but those directly touched still carried weight in its time, shaping how men lived, how they spoke, how they measured themselves against others. History's great figures stood in the same silence as unknown captains and forgotten merchants. The difference lies only in what was recorded, not in the meaning of the act itself. What unites the famous and the forgotten duels is the strange logic of the duel, that identity, honor, and reputation were worth more than life. Whether on a field in Weehawken, New Jersey, where Hamilton fell, or in an unmarked meadow outside a small European village where two unknown officers crossed swords, the essence was the same. Death risked at dawn was the ultimate proof of dignity. And though history remembers some and loses others, the truth remains that every duel, in its own way, changed history. Whether of a nation, a regiment, a family, or a single man's legacy. As you drift toward rest tonight, imagine two duelists once more. One will be remembered for centuries, his name printed in books, his story retold in classrooms. The other will be forgotten, his name never spoken beyond his own generation. But in that moment, on the field at dawn, both stood with equal courage, both risked everything, both lived within the same haunting silence of honor. And in that silence, famous or forgotten, they were the same. Picture a field at dawn, where a duel has just ended. The mist still clings to the ground, the grass is dark with dew, and the echoes of a single shot hang in the silence. One man lies wounded, perhaps dying, while the other stands frozen, pistol trembling in his hand. Seconds rush forward, witnesses hover, and the air is thick with shock. Yet beyond this field, far away in quiet homes and busy streets, others wait. Wives, children, parents, friends, who will feel the true cost of what has just unfolded. The duel, though fought by two men, was never about two men alone. It was about the entire network of lives bound to them, the reputations of families, the futures of children, the stability of society itself. When we speak of honor defended at dawn, we must also speak of the many lives wounded in silence long after the pistols were lowered. The family bore the heaviest burden. A wife might kiss her husband goodnight, not knowing whether she would ever see him again in the morning. Some women pleaded with their husbands to avoid duels, but persuasion rarely worked, for to refuse was to invite shame worse than death. When the husband did not return, the widow faced not only grief, but uncertainty. A dead man could not provide for his family, and depending on his rank or fortune, debts might swallow estates. Children grew up fatherless, their futures shadowed by an event they had no part in. Even when the duelists survived, scars, both physical and emotional, often lingered, shaping family life in quiet, painful ways. Friends, too, carried the weight. To serve as a second was to risk one's own reputation. A second who negotiated poorly, who seemed to push too hard for violence, or who failed to defend his friend's interests, could himself be called into question. Some were even drawn into secondary duels, challenged for their actions during the first. For those who simply watched, the memory of blood spilled at dawn could linger for decades. Letters from witnesses reveal nightmares, guilt, and sorrow, even when they had done everything according to the code. They remembered the sight of men they respected falling in silence, and they carried that burden quietly into old age. Society itself bore the long shadow of the duel. In aristocratic circles, the constant risk of dueling created an atmosphere of tension, where every word had to be weighed, every gesture measured, every insult carefully avoided or carefully delivered. This culture of fragile pride bred fear as much as courage. Young men learned early that their futures could hinge not only on their education or connections, but on their ability to face death with dignity. Parents raised their sons with the knowledge that honor was more precious than life, and in doing so, they perpetuated the cycle. The duel was not simply an act of violence, but a ritual embedded in the very structure of society. The cost extended to politics and governance. When a statesman fell in a duel, his absence could alter policy, shift alliances, or destabilize leadership. Governments lost talented voices to duels that solved nothing. Armies lost experienced officers in contests that had nothing to do with the battlefield. Nations weakened themselves in the name of personal honor. Yet because society insisted on the ritual, men continued to fight, sacrificing public good for private reputation. The duel, while framed as noble, often inflicted wounds on entire communities and nations. We must also consider the economic cost. Duels could devastate estates, particularly when debts were left unpaid or when survivors were too young to manage inheritance. Legal disputes often followed, though courts had little power to undo the damage. Merchants who dueled risked the stability of businesses, leaving partners and employees adrift. In cities, the ripple effects of a single death could spread wide, disrupting not only families, but entire networks of trade and labor. What looked like a private affair at dawn could by midday be felt in markets and households far beyond the dueling ground. And yet, society tolerated it. Families grieved, friends mourned, economies strained, but the duel persisted. Why? Because the very fabric of reputation, so central to these societies, demanded it. A man who refused to fight dishonored not only himself, but his family. His children might be mocked, his wife pitied, his lineage stained. The duel, as dangerous as it was, offered the only path to preserve dignity. Families might lose husbands, fathers, brothers, but they retained honor. And in that strange calculation, honor was valued above life. The forgotten tragedy lies in the women and children left behind. Their voices are faint in history, drowned out by the louder tales of men who stood with pistols or swords. Yet their suffering was immense. Widows sometimes remarried, sometimes sank into poverty, sometimes carried bitterness for life. Children grew up hearing stories of their father's bravery, but living with the emptiness his absence left. Families shaped their identity around a duel they had never chosen, and for generations, that memory colored their place in society. Even communities bore the scars of the duel. In small towns, a duel between local notables could divide loyalties for years. Families took sides, friendships broke apart, and bitterness simmered long after the duelists were gone. In cities, duels between officers or politicians fed gossip that traveled far, shaping public opinion and sowing discord. What happened quietly at dawn often echoed loudly afterward, reverberating through society like a shot that never truly faded. The cost of honor was not only in the lives lost, but in the lives reshaped by silence, absence, and memory. Behind every duel stood a web of people whose futures bent beneath its weight. Friends carried guilt, families carried grief, societies carried division. And yet the duel endured, precisely because its cost was so high. It was the willingness to pay that cost that made honor valuable. Without that risk, honor would have been meaningless.
Imagine once more the silent field at dawn. Two men stand facing one another, their coats buttoned against the chill, their weapons gleaming faintly in the pale light. Seconds murmur, witnesses hold their breath, and for a moment the air is charged with that familiar tension, the possibility that a single movement will decide the fate of both men. Yet, as we step further into history, we find that these scenes, once so common, began to fade. Slowly, quietly at first, and then more rapidly, the duel lost its grip on society. What had once been the ultimate language of honor became an anachronism, a relic of another age. The decline of the duel was not sudden, but gradual, shaped by law, culture, politics, and the changing values of entire societies. To trace its fall is to trace the moment when men finally decided that words, institutions, and reputations could be preserved without blood spilled in the grass. The decline began with law, though law alone was never enough. Kings, parliaments, and governments issued decree after decree forbidding duels. Monarchs saw too many noblemen lost, too many officers killed, too many voices silenced in needless rituals. Armies weakened themselves as talented leaders fell not on the battlefield, but in private contests of pride. Rulers recognized the waste and tried to stop it. Yet for centuries, the laws were ignored. Honor could not be legislated away. Men obeyed the unspoken code of their peers more than the written edicts of kings. Still, each law chipped away at legitimacy. Each proclamation added weight to the argument that dueling was no longer acceptable. The law was like a persistent tide, washing again and again against the shore of tradition, until slowly the ground beneath the duel eroded. Culture changed as well. In earlier centuries, the duel was framed as noble, even poetic. Writers and dramatists celebrated the courage of men who defended their honor with steel or powder. Songs were sung, stories retold, reputations immortalized. But as time passed, the romance faded. Literature began to mock the practice, portraying duelists as foolish, reckless, or vain. Satire replaced celebration, and public opinion began to shift. The duel no longer seemed like the mark of nobility. It seemed like the mark of outdated pride. And in a world that was modernizing rapidly, industrializing, expanding, moving toward new ideas of law and justice, such outdated pride
began to look more and more absurd. Science and medicine played their role as well. As societies learned more about the fragility of life, as doctors spoke with authority about wounds and death, the brutal reality of dueling could no longer be hidden behind the veil of honor. Medical reports described shattered bones, agonizing deaths, and the sufferings of families left behind. The more people knew about the consequences, the harder it became to sustain the illusion of nobility. Knowledge stripped away some of the mystique, leaving only the truth. The duel was not romantic theater, but deliberate risk of death for reasons that seemed smaller with each passing decade. Politics hastened the decline as well. The cost of losing key figures in pointless duels became too high. Leaders who might have guided nations fell to pistols in gardens or swords in fields. With time, governments realized that the duel was not only a private matter, but a public danger. The death of a statesman could shift alliances, alter policies, and destabilize regimes. The duel was no longer seen as a safeguard of honor, but a threat to stability. As nations grew more complex, as governments relied on institutions rather than individuals alone, the personal defense of honor seemed less necessary, even reckless. The rise of new ideas about justice and civility also reshaped the landscape. Courts expanded their role, offering avenues for slander and insult to be addressed legally rather than violently. Newspapers became powerful, allowing men to defend their reputations publicly through words rather than duels. Education broadened, teaching values of rational debate over physical confrontation. Slowly, society began to believe that words could be sharper than swords in another way, not in insult, but in persuasion. The duel became less the mark of courage and more the sign of a man who could not argue with reason. This shift in values was perhaps the most decisive blow of all. Even the military, once the fiercest defender of dueling, began to abandon it. Armies could not afford to lose officers to private quarrels when larger battles loomed. Codes of conduct were rewritten, emphasizing loyalty to the state over personal pride. Courage was to be proven on the battlefield, not in the hedges of a garden. As professionalization increased, dueling became less a requirement of command and more a liability. A man who risked himself in a duel risked his regiment, his country, his cause. Honor found new definitions: discipline, leadership, and service, and the old definitions fell away. The decline was uneven. In some places, dueling lingered well into the 19th century. Romantic stories still held sway in certain circles, and men continued to meet at dawn in defiance of changing norms. Famous duels still captured headlines, shocking societies that were beginning to see them as relics. Yet each famous duel was more scandalous than the last, each survivor less praised and more ridiculed. The practice clung stubbornly to life, but it no longer commanded respect. It became spectacle rather than tradition, embarrassment rather than honor. The final decline came when public opinion shifted decisively. Families, long the silent sufferers, began to speak more openly against the practice. Newspapers condemned it. Politicians denounced it. Communities turned their backs on duelists. Once, a man might be ruined by refusing a duel. Now he might be ruined by agreeing to one. The values of society had turned upside down, and the very ritual that once safeguarded reputation now destroyed it. In this reversal lay the true end of the duel, not in laws or decrees, but in the hearts of the very people who had once demanded it. The duel did not vanish instantly. Isolated contests continued, some as late as the 20th century, stubborn echoes of a fading world. But by then, they were curiosities, oddities, noted with surprise rather than respect. The great age of dueling was over. The fields at dawn grew quiet. Pistols gathered dust in cabinets. Swords hung on walls as relics of another age. Honor found new expressions, safer, less bloody, and society moved on. Yet even in its decline, the duel left a legacy. It shaped our understanding of reputation, of courage, of the strange power of perception. It reminds us that human beings will go to extraordinary lengths to defend their place in society, even to the point of death. And it shows how cultures can change, how rituals once considered sacred can, in time, be seen as absurd. The duel teaches us not only about the past, but about the fragility of our own customs, the possibility that what we consider vital today may, in centuries to come, be viewed as folly. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine that last duel, the one that history barely recorded. Two men stand at dawn, their breaths cold in the morning air, their weapons heavy in hand. But unlike their ancestors, they are not admired. They are pitied, even mocked. Their act is no longer a performance of honor, but a relic of pride that the world has outgrown. The pistols fire, perhaps, or the swords clash briefly, but the silence that follows is different now. It is not reverent. It is final. The duel, once the guardian of reputation, is gone, leaving only stories whispered in history's quiet pages.
The long journey of the duel has carried us across fields at dawn, through candlelit halls where insults first flared, and into the silence where reputations hung heavier than life itself. We have seen the unspoken codes, the careful rituals, the weapons gleaming in mist, and the heavy cost borne not only by the men who fought, but by the families, friends, and societies left behind. We have walked alongside seconds who carried letters of challenge with trembling hands, witnessed the sharp words that cut deeper than steel, and felt the weight of silence as pistols fired or swords clashed. The duel, so strange and haunting, was never simply violence. It was theater, ritual, obsession, and above all, a performance of identity in a world where honor was fragile. And yet, as centuries passed, the duel faded. Laws pressed against it, cultures mocked it, new institutions replaced it. The very act that once safeguarded a man's dignity became the mark of outdated pride. Slowly, the fields at dawn grew empty, the pistols silent, the swords gathering dust. But the memory of the duel endures, not in the clash of weapons, but in the questions it leaves us. How far will people go to defend reputation? How much power does perception truly hold? And how do societies decide in time that what once seemed sacred is no longer necessary? Perhaps that is why the duel still fascinates us. It reminds us that honor and shame, though dressed in different clothes, still shape human lives. We may no longer meet at dawn with weapons in hand, but the fear of humiliation and the need to be respected remain as powerful as ever. The duel has ended, but the echoes of its logic linger quietly in the ways we live, speak, and guard our own reputations. So let the image fade now. The meadow is empty, the mist lifting, the silence broken only by birdsong. No men stand waiting, no seconds measure paces, no weapons gleam in the light. The duel belongs to history, its stories whispered now only as we drift toward sleep. And in that gentle quiet, we leave behind the theater of honor, the fields of ritual, the strange and haunting echoes of courage and pride. Good night, and may the silence of history carry you softly into rest.